That reason can only tell us about what is. You cannot derive an ought from an is. And I'm thinking, so Descartes lays the predicate for the epistemological problems we're dealing with, and Hume lays the predicate for the moral development problems. So how can we talk about morality when facts and values are separated? And we all know, right, rhetorically, I don't believe this necessarily, we all know what are teachers' jobs to do in the classroom. Just teach the facts. There's no role in education for moral development or character development. Our job is to teach valueless facts. And that's assumed to be true in very much of traditional education. The conclusion is that educational implication is that education must be value-free. Education becomes the inculcation of facts and has nothing to do with character development. Therefore, education has nothing to do with character-based matters like social justice. It's none of your business to be dealing with social justice issues, say the Humean-inspired traditional education. Somebody else will do that, but that's not your job. So do you see where we've got a problem in Western culture? We've got an epistemological problem, separation of mind and body, empirical sources of knowledge, rational sources of knowledge. We've divorced the notion of reason from the notion of knowledge and from morality and character development. And these are things that we've inherited is from in contemporary education. Hahn argued, if I can get to my next slide here. Josh mentioned this, and I'm going to build on it a little bit. Hahn was fascinated by ancient Greek philosophy, specifically Aristotle and Plato. And of course, for those of you who don't know, when you're reading Plato, you're also reading Socrates, the great ancient philosopher who was put to death in Athens by the citizens of Athens for corrupting the young and daring to have the young raise questions about things that they were not supposed to be raising questions about. And Socrates, the line, there's a straight line of thought from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, that by engaging young people in critical question asking, you will help develop their mind and their character together. Aristotle, to say to Aristotle that we teach value-free and that we teach devoid of the development of character in young people, Aristotle would think that's absolute insanity. And Hahn, again, I'm so glad that Josh did the background he did. Hahn was confronted with a European educational tradition that just assumed the Humean and the Cartesian stuff that I have just now been talking about. For the Greeks, I just want to mention a couple of things here. And this is going to loop into modern experiential thought, and I'm still on track. There are four basic virtues for the Greeks. For Plato, for Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they would have assumed this to be true. And Aristotle makes it explicit in the ethics. It's in Nicomachean Ethics, if you want a footnote on that. Courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. And a teacher who does not attempt to teach those four basic virtues is a teacher who is negligent and who is not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Now, the virtues all admit of excess and defect. If you're overly courageous, you become reckless. Reckless is not good. We all know that. We're experts at that, right? Temperance has to do with controlling your passions, whatever they may be. If your passion is money, if it's food, if it's sex, if it's power, if that's what your passion is, you have the virtue of temperance to control your passions. And this is foundational. Justice. Justice has to do morally with beyond my self-interest. In the interest of the greater polis, if you will, P-O-L-S, the city-state, or the greater community would be a better modern language to use. So I want to suggest here to you that Hahn immersed himself, and Josh just footnoted that. So Josh said it must be true. is that Hahn was influenced by ancient Greek philosophy, and the ancient Greeks did not make the kinds of mistakes that we moderns have made. And that's an argument again from Alistair McIntyre, which that's a different talk. I don't have time to get into McIntyre right now. But I flag that for your consideration. I'll just add down here that for Aristotle, inherent in any educational practice is the importance that character plays. To attempt to teach without regard to the development of character would be nonsense for Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. The same holds true for experiential educators today. To teach facts without connecting facts to human character is nonsense. And Hahn certainly believed that. Josh made my job a little easier here. I want to say something. He talked about William James, the great philosopher. This one got the date up. In 1910, did coin the phrase, the moral equivalent of war. And you've heard this from Josh, so there's no reason for me to repeat that in much more detail. But the basic argument from William James, and this is again coming out of the post-Civil War, a lot of people died to end slavery in this country. And James was influenced by that, even though that's not originally what Lincoln was concerned about, but that's again a different talk. But William James was blown away by the notion that participation in war oftentimes brings out the best in people. I can tell a story now. I don't think Joel would mind me telling this story. I hope I'm on ethical, solid ground. But Joel called me up about a month before he died in my office, and he was tearful and he was upset about something. And he said, "Jasper, can I tell you something that's been haunting me for a long time?" And I said, "Sure, Joel. I've listened to a lot of soldiers in my career, in my life. I'm fascinated by that stuff." Joel said, "As an Air Force PJ, we flew into a hot LZ landing zone. There was a battle going on. And as a pararescue jumper, these were Army infantry troops. We had to go out and pull out the wounded and get them onto helicopters and get them medevaced out." And Joel said, "I've never told anybody this, but I'm telling you right now. I grabbed an American soldier who had been wounded. I jumped out of the helicopter. There was a wounded American soldier. I ran over and I grabbed him. I flung him on the back of my back, and I humped over to the medevac helicopter. Right at that moment, a North Vietnamese soldier opened up, full automatic with an AK-47, and the soldier I was trying to rescue took all of the rounds and died as I was trying to get him onto the helicopter. And that soldier saved Joel's life, and he was haunted by that. He felt guilty that he lived, that American soldier saved him. And by dying for him, even though the American soldier didn't mean to save his life. That's the kind of heroism, that's the kind of self-sacrifice that James is talking about here, where war cultures spend money, they sacrifice, they do all kinds of things in the name of warfare. And James was appalled by that, completely appalled by that, and thought we've got to figure out a way as a culture to let young people test themselves, do things that are what he called the moral equivalent of war. I can tell you anecdotally, in my work at Minnesota State University, I don't so much anymore, but I used to work with ROTC a lot, the Reserve Officer Training Corps. And I did a lot of hands-on work with them to the point of helping with some of their training. And I can tell you that young cadets who are getting ready to branch infantry, they have to branch certain things at some point. They're going to get commissioned. They want to go to war. They have all of this training. They prepare for it. The older ones, those master sergeants, and I'll look at them like they're crazy, say, "No, you don't want to go to war." "Yes, I do, Sergeant. I want to go to war." And I can tell you from firsthand experience, not so much Signal Corps, not so much hospital administration or medical corps, but infantry, armor, combat, our field artillery, combat engineers, they want to go to war. war. They want to test themselves. I mean, it seemed, and then they found out to their horror later that it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. James's concern here was that if we could come up with something that allows young people to test themselves, that truly will test you, it will satisfy that need in ways that might be a prophylaxis, if you will, to warlike behavior, to warlike. Why would you want to go climb Mount Everest when you don't have to? Why would you climb Liberty Ridge on Rainier when you could go up the Dog's Head? I mean, that was St. Helens. Up the Disappointment Cleaver route. Why would you? Well, the reason is just because I think most of us have been there. We've done things where we test ourselves, and we want to extend our limits. We want to look the dragon in the eye. That's whoever said that, Mary. That is one of my favorite quotes. Young boys and girls need to be slaying dragons and not sitting in rows taking PowerPoints. And the young people do want to slay dragons. That has been my experience. And so that's what William James was talking about when he talked about the morally equivalent of war. I have down here the declines of modern youth, the 7 laws of Salem or Zalem if you speak German, and you've already gotten that from Josh, so I'm not gonna repeat that. He did a very nice job of doing that, so I'll stop with that. So the Hahn part of my talk was adequately covered, and you all may be thinking mercifully so we can get out of here sooner. So I'll skip Hahn. Again, Josh, that was good. I thought very, very helpful on what you did. I want to jump from James and the moral equivalent of war to a modern example, and this is one of my, since I get to do the talk, I get to indulge in one of my crusades. There was a woman that I bet most of you all have never heard of named Septima Clark. And if you study the American Civil Rights Movement going back into the late 40s, 50s, 60s, one of the things that I've been struck, and it's one of my favorite, I grew up in that era and I'm fascinated by it. And there's some amazing women that took place that were involved in all of that. People like Ella Baker, Diane Nash. Again, sometimes people have not heard of some of these names. But specifically, Septima Clark. Septima Clark was the educator. You had and again, I'm going to give some history interpretation here that might be irritating to some people, and I hope I'm not offending anybody, but I think I'm right about this. The civil rights movement that I grew up in the Deep South was dominated by the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the NAACP. The SCLC, by and large, was a group they were preachers primarily, Southern black preachers. And the NAACP was an organization of lawyers. And one of the things that happened is these big male egos in the civil rights movement oftentimes shoved the women aside. And I'm not putting down Martin Luther King or Andrew Young or John Lewis or the names that you've all heard about. But so often in reading of this history, you've not heard of a lot of the women. Again, the Ella Bakers, the Diane Nashes, and the Septima Clarks. Septima Clark was doing liberatory education a long time before Paulo Freire. Nothing against Freire. I teach him. I think it's great stuff. I think everybody should read Freire. But Septima Clark was doing that stuff before Freire was. And the way she was doing it, it was very organic. They had these laws down south where I grew up. There were literacy laws for voting. So if you wanted to vote, they'd give you a test, and then you have to read this, and they would ask you questions and give you the equivalent of a GRE exam, the written part. If you couldn't pass it, you couldn't vote. And Septima Clark was a professional teacher, African-American teacher of that era. Her date is, well, that date made it to the slide, so I hate when people put PowerPoints and then read you what's on the PowerPoint. You can read that. She was the daughter of a former slave. She taught basic literacy at a Highlander folk school. Some of you may have heard that in the 50s and 60s. And her big thing was, okay, NAACP, movers and shakers. Okay, SCLC, movers and shakers. You all are trying to change the laws and all the power to you, go for it. Meanwhile, I'm going to try to teach illiterate people how to read and write. And it could be that until these laws get changed, they can start passing the literacy exams and start voting. So there was an element of Septima Clark that I find absolutely fascinating. She did the best she could with what she had. She couldn't wait for the laws to get changed. She was 100% supportive of what King and the NAACP and the SCLC were doing. But at the same time, she thought, until these things get changed, I've got to get down and I've got to teach people who do not know how to read and write, how to read and write, because it can be very, very helpful to them. And here's how she did it. She did it with experiential methods. She taught mathematics by using seed and fertilizer calculations. She taught literacy by moving from street signs and newspapers to how to register to vote. You can drive a car. Can you read the word stop? Can you read the letters 55 miles an hour? Let's make the move from that basic. So she would use the
Here's the bird.
what divides us. You know, the therapists know more about eating disorders than I do, and that's fine. That's your area. The corporate trainers know more about working with corporate groups. The ACCT ropes course builders know more about strand vices than I know about. The project-based educators in the charter schools know more about project-based learning with 14-year-olds than I do. And so we do have these specialty areas. Lee Gillis and the research people know more than I do about empirical research. All the power to you. But I do think that there are things that unite us that are very, very, very central and that are very, very important. And I would urge us as we look, the 40, I thought about this driving down. I thought 40 years from now, I'm not going to be here. I'm 60 years old. And I'll bet you that 40 years from now, some of you are going to be here. And you're going to be like me. You're going to have an old-timer thing on your tag. And I hope, you might remember that some of the things we wrestled with 40 years ago, 40 years ahead. And be a voice for my good friend Don Friend, who's chair of the geography department at MSU. He's also a former Outward Bound instructor at Colorado Outward Bound School. And Don and I were talking about this talk. He said, Jasper, the American Geographical Association, or Society, I can't remember what it is, 60 years ago we had the same issue. The American Geographical Society, we've got the physical geographers, we've got the cultural geographers, we've got the cartographers, we've got the weather experts, and there was a serious talk about the American Geographical Society splitting up and forming separate organizations. And there were some cooler heads that prevailed, Don told me, that didn't let that happen. They said, no, the cultural geographers and the cartographers and the weather experts and the physical geographers all should be talking to each other. So my final talk, my final admonition to you all here, and I'm within my time limit, but it is to reach out, recognize those things that unite us. Don't be threatened because someone knows more than you do about chi-square analysis and empirical research, or don't be upset that somebody else knows more than you do about experiential therapy with whatever it is, population that they're talking about. That's fine, but we do have some things that unite us. So my final comment is to stick together, is to recognize that I think the two strands, the epistemological and the character and moral concern, do unite us. We should stick together. We've done it so far in the last 40 years, and I would suggest and admonish us that we do it for the next 40 years. So that's what I have to say.